All right, friends, today we celebrate a feast day, the feast day of Saint who and who? Who is it? Timothy and Titus. Timothy and Titus. This is what I think is pretty cool about how the church celebrates feast days sometimes. Yesterday, you guys didn't have Mass here, but yesterday the church celebrated the feast day of the conversion of St. Paul. So yesterday we listened to the story of Saul of Tarsus riding on the road to Damascus. He's knocked to the ground by this light, and Jesus calls out to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He says, "Who are you, sir?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." It's that powerful moment where Jesus broke into Saul's life, transformed his life, set him on this new path, ignited his heart with this new love, this new desire. He took this new name, Paul, and he begins preaching. He begins preaching everywhere. He traveled thousands of miles preaching the gospel, telling everybody he could get in front of about the love of Jesus Christ, the power of Jesus Christ, that in this man, Jesus of Nazareth, God entered creation, and that this man was put to death on a cross, but death couldn't hold him. He was buried, that he rose from the dead. And Paul was preaching this powerful message everywhere. And people were listening. And people's lives were being changed. And two of those people who were listening, whose lives were changed, were this guy named Timothy and this other guy named Titus. Now, I know when we think of like saints, when we think of Saints Timothy and Titus, we probably think of like old guys, big beards, long robes, right? Because that's how they often look at artwork. They probably weren't old guys with big beards and long robes. Okay, they probably had robes, but they weren't old guys. This is my point. They were probably in their teenage years. They were probably 16, 17, 18. They weren't old. They weren't old guys. They were high schoolers, let's just say. Juniors and seniors in high school. And they heard this guy, Paul, proclaiming this message. And it was so powerful, it was moving things in their heart. It's like their hearts were being set on fire. Like, whatever you have, Paul, I want. Like, however you're seeing reality, I want to see reality that way. The kind of freedom that you have, I want to have. And so they began to follow Paul, and he was forming them and teaching them. And he gave them positions of authority and responsibility over different churches. These guys became the first bishops, which is kind of crazy when you think of like a high school kid as a bishop, right? But they were the first bishops. Paul's preaching, Paul's life, the way that he lived, everything, what he shared with them that he received from Jesus, right? He receives from Jesus, he shared with them, that changed their lives. All of this got me thinking about like how discipleship works, right? That the disciples, people who've met Jesus, they make disciples. Disciples make disciples. And that got me thinking about my own life, my own story. You guys know my story, most of you, right? That like I didn't go to Catholic school. I wasn't really growing up in the faith. I wasn't going to church with my family. But then, around my junior year of high school, when I was 16 years old, this priest came to my church, and I began to listen to him preach and teach. His name was Father Damien. Father Damien he was basically a brand new priest. He was ordained in 2003. Amazing guy. Amazing preacher. I remember thinking about the way that he lived, the way that he preached, what he did. He was so inspiring, and the things that he would say, it like set a fire in my heart. Like, he was Paul and I was Timothy. He was Paul, I was Titus, right? And it began to change my life. Like, I am here talking to you because of what Father Damien, said to me. But it didn't start with him, because Father Damien had his own priests and people, right? So in our friendship, he's shared with me the priests that have inspired him. There's lots of people that inspire us, but he looks back and he looks at Father Krisner. Father Krisner was the chaplain who was assigned at Holy Name, his high school. This amazing priest who inspired him, who preached to him, who took time with him. Another priest, Father Lee Monroe, who was a professor at the seminary. These other priests who inspired Father Damien, who then inspired me. And I think about, okay, now who were the guys that inspired those guys? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. But I'm sure there's an answer to that question. I'm sure that if you could ask Father Monroe, if you could ask Father Krisner, who were the priests that inspired you? Who were the people whose faith ignited your faith? They could tell you an answer to that question. Oh, it was his father so-and-so. It was his father so-and-so. Like, this is how this works, right? It's like a chain where every person is like a link in the chain, passing something down generation to generation, person to person, person to person. Like, this is how the faith works. This is how the faith spreads. It happens when people who receive something give it away. That's how it works. When you receive something, you give it away. Like, this is what we're commanded in the scriptures that we hear today, right? So St. Paul, he's writing to Timothy, his student. He's writing to Timothy, and he's telling him a few things. He says, "For this reason, I remind you to stir into flame the gift of God that you have through the imposition of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of love and self-control." So this is the part right here. "Do not be ashamed of your testimony to the Lord." Do not be ashamed of your testimony to the Lord. In other words, Paul is saying, don't be afraid to tell your story. Do not be afraid to share the faith that you have. Don't be afraid to share it. Don't be afraid to tell the story of how God has affected you, Timothy. Right? Just like I, Paul, wasn't afraid to tell you the story of what happened to me on the road to Damascus. I told you this story. Now you tell someone else your story. Right? Or the psalm that we just sang, proclaim to all of the nations. Was it the marvelous deeds of God? What was it? Tell us what it was. Proclaim to all the nations. Nice and loud. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to how many of the nations? All of the nations. And how many people is included in all of the nations? All the people. All the people, right? It doesn't say proclaim God's marvelous deeds to the people who you know and who already believe in Jesus. No, it's proclaim God's marvelous deeds to all the nations. In other words, open your mouths, disciples, and tell people the story of how God has affected you. Share your testimony. Proclaim what he's done. Right? In the gospel, Jesus sends out disciples 2 by 2 into the world to proclaim, to get people ready to meet him. Other places in the gospel, we hear Jesus say, you don't light a lamp and then put it under a bushel basket. Like, you don't light a lamp and then cover it up. Why? Because that is silly. That's not how lamps work, right? You light the lamp and you set it in the middle of the house so it gives light everywhere. Guys, this is what we're called to, right? This is what we're called to. So this is what I want to do. I want to make this practical. Raise your hand if you have an older kid who's your buddy in the school. If you got a bigger kid who's your buddy. Okay. We got some buddies. Okay. Now put your hands down. Now raise your hand if you are one of those older kid buddies. Hey, buddies. Okay. Now, big kid buddies, this is your challenge. Sometime in the next week or two, I want you to tell your buddy some aspect, some story, something about how God has affected you. I want you to share a testimony. I want you to share how God has touched your life. Little buddies, raise your hands again. Little buddies, raise your hands. Okay, little buddies. Okay. I want you to look at your big buddy and say, tell me a story. Go ahead. About how God has touched your life. Okay. You have a job to do, big people. Right? You get to be Paul to little Timothys and Tituses. Right? Share your story. Because if we don't do it, it doesn't get passed on. It doesn't get passed on. So on this feast day of Saints Timothy and Titus, guys, we're going to ask for their intercession that we would be bold, we would be fearless, and we'd be willing to tell our stories. And those of you who maybe don't have a buddy in this school, I don't know if that's even anybody, everybody at some point should tell your story to somebody. Let me tell you a story about how Jesus affected my life. Let me tell you about this moment that I had in prayer. Let me tell you about this experience I had in adoration. Let me tell you about this thing that happened to me. Proclaim God's marvelous deeds to everyone around you. Amen?